Prologue.
And now 19 persons having been hanged, and 1 pressed to death, and 8 more condemned, in all 20 and 8 of which above a third part were members of some of the churches of New England, and more than half of them of a good conversation in general, and not one cleared, about 50 having confessed themselves to be witches, of which not one executed, above 150 in person, and 200 more accused. The special commission of Oyer and Terminer comes to a period.
Robert Califf, 1692. The Reverend Parson. November 31st, 1655.
Reverend!
Barked a young boy who knocked on the door.
Reverend Parson! Me mom has sent your milk!
9-year-old Gabriel Beckett was nervous and kept looking over his shoulder. His leather boots were old and wrapped in a thick blue cloth. His wool mittens had holes from overuse, and his scarf and jacket were heavy and worn. He pushed the wool hat from his eyebrow so he could better see the door. The sky had turned gray, and a muddy 6-inch, 3-day-old snowfall was on the ground. He knocked again and waited before calling out,
Reverend, I've got to get home before the weather starts. Me dad said we're getting another storm. And with all the happenings going about, I don't feel safe.
The weather wasn't the only reason the boy felt dread. It was no longer safe for the Christian reformist congregants of Reverend Parson's assembly.
Mom's worried about the Calvinists and the turf war,
he said. Gabriel craned his neck, looking over his shoulders and checking behind him.
She's afraid they'll come after me.
2 years earlier, the Calvinist Church began a violent and slanderous campaign against the Reverend Parson's new congregation of reformists. Dangerous accusations and innuendos led to scuffles, shoving matches, and eventually fistfights in the square.
Reverend Parson, I've got to get home. If those black hearts catch me, they'll kill me straight away. Especially because my dad isn't with me, and they're still blaming him for Black Easter Monday.
That past Easter, the violence reached its peak. Calvinists attacked reformists preparing for Good Friday, wounded 2 and torched an elder's home. Retaliation was swift and deadly. On Black Easter Monday, men from Parsons Church killed the Calvinist ringleader and hanged him from a tree overlooking Mill Pond. Supposition placed Gabriel's father as the master of thugs and the one who tied the noose. The boy's fingers twitched as he wrung his hands from anxiety. He didn't enjoy coming to the pond anymore, not since the murders, witch trials, and executions.
Reverend, Mom and Dad believe nothing they're saying about you, and I don't know what any of it means. Please open the door so I can get home.
Calvinist inquisitors accused Parsons' congregation of witchery and black magic. They tried 5 women from his church for being in league with the devil and possession of witches' bottles. They sentenced 4 to hang from the tree overlooking Mill Pond.
Reverend, heard my dad say that you were making people nervous. I'm supposed to make sure I talk to you before I go. Mom says that Dad's barely seen you since Miss Muldoon's death at the picket.
The good wife, Murren Muldoon, was the 5th woman convicted. She was the only one, however, said to possess the pamphlet The Witch's Hammer, and was privately burned at the stake. Gabriel stepped from the wooden porch and peered around the corner. He looked for footprints or any sign that the Reverend was home. Distracted by the undisturbed snow, he knelt and took a handful. Though it chilled his fingers, he molded it into a tight ball. Taking a step back, he lunged forward and threw the ball at his house.
Reverend,
he shouted.
I don't know what adultery is, but my mom doesn't believe that you and Miss Muldoon were fornicating.
Most reformist congregants knew that Parson, though married, had an eye for Murren Muldoon. It wasn't a surprise when the Calvinists accused them of an affair. Their accusation involved deviant sexual practices and spellcasting by Muldoon. They determined it corrupted Parson and the church. So on November 24th, they burned Murren Muldoon at the stake for being a witch, but only Reverend Parson, the Calvinist leaders, and the inquisitors were allowed to watch. Gabriel tried once more.
Reverend!
He yelled.
It's me, Gabriel! Please open the door. I'm cold and I want to go for supper.
Curious as most boys are, Gabriel saw several blackbirds coming and going from the oak tree down the road on the mill pond's edge. He lost focus on the assignment given by his mother and began counting. Pointing with his finger, Gabriel rattled off their number.
8, 9, 10, and 11.
Though freezing and the cold biting his feet, he wanted to see what they were doing.
Reverend, I'm going to the tree. I'm leaving the milk on the porch.
He jumped from the steps and made his way from the front yard onto the main road. The tree was still some distance off, but he was close enough to hear the birds' wings and their gurgling croak. He soon realized that the blackbirds were ravens, targeting something hanging from the tree. They bobbed and weaved, seeing the flesh through their taloned feet. Gabriel stopped, went to the pond bed, and pushed the snow from the ground. Then, finding the perfect-sized throwing stone, he ran and hurled it at the trees.
Get on with it now, you daft crazy birds!
Although his toss fell short of the mark, it was now a game.
Damn you black-hearted beast! Get off ya!
He rustled the snow, scanning the ground for another projectile. Seeing nothing, he again moved to the pond bed, kneeling to push aside the snow, dirt, and sand.
"Whoa, you're a good-un, Boyle,"
he said, finding the heaviest rock that he could throw. But when he looked up, his stomach dropped. What once hid behind the massive tree trunk revealed itself. Gabriel didn't move, still kneeling in the snow. He felt the wind hit his cheek, and every time it did, this object swayed. His heart pounded and his mouth went dry. The stone in his hand was no longer a toy, it was a weapon. Curious, as most boys are, he needed to see more. He stood, cocked his hand behind his head, and crept up on the tree. The ravens were no longer his focus. The sound of creaking replaced their fluttering and croaking. He grasped the stone tight and was ready to throw it when a strong wind hit him in the cheek. His wool hat that covered his ears flew from his head. Forgetting the moment and his fear, he chased it to the foot of the ice. He refused to put down the rock and struggled with replacing the hat over his ears and forehead. When he finally mastered the task, he turned toward the tree.
"I'm not afraid of you, not at all,"
he said. But then the wind shifted, and a dreadful smell smacked him in the face. It was wet and acrid and smelled like rot. He dropped the rock and pulled his scarf over his nose. As he dry heaved, he'd like to vomit. He fell to his knees on the pond's edge. His hands were frozen and he heaved on the ice. Terror overtook him. The ravens were silent, flying away from the tree. Then he heard that creaking sound again. It was harsh, grating, and constant now. Gabriel shivered.
"Me mum says there's no such thing as the Banshee. I don't believe in you!"
He felt the lump in his throat and the tears well in his eyes. He gritted his teeth and counted in his head. His thoughts turned to words as he breathed harder.
1, 2, 3.
He let out a war cry. But when he saw it dangling from the tree, his heart throbbed and he lost his breath. He wailed and ran onto the road and past the Reverend's house. It wasn't an hour before Gabriel returned with his father and others. The snow had been falling, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Gabriel stood in the road halfway between the Reverend Parson's house and the tree. Surrounded by grown men he knew his whole life, he'd never felt so alone. His finger trembled as he pointed toward the tree.
There. Please don't make me go. It's there. I don't want to see it ever again."
Gabriel's father knelt, so he and his son were eye to eye. He put his hands on Gabriel's shoulders and, with his thumbs, wiped the tears from the boy's eyes.
"I'm proud of you, me wee bairn," he said.
He adjusted Gabriel's wool hat and gave a slight tug on his ear.
"You're very courageous, me boyo. You handled yourself very well. But it's late, and we must see to taking himself down."
Gabriel's father stood back up and waved the other men ahead.
"I want you to go inside the Reverend's home. Your mum and sister are making soup. I need you to take care of them until we get back. Can you do that for me, Gabriel?"
"Come on,"
the boy said. His father looked him in the eye, proud of what his son had done. Gabriel wasn't finished. He was still confused. Why did they call it a body? He didn't understand and just wanted to know what was hanging from the tree. He took a deep breath, gulped, and tried to wet his lips. And he asked,
Duh? What is that?
His father's smile turned, and his eyes and face wrinkled. The boy's Da shook his head, looked at the sky, and breathed out with a heavy sigh. Gabriel sensed his hesitation.
It's not what, lad, he said. It's who. That's the Reverend Parson hanging from the tree, me bairn. Those cold-blooded bastards murdered him.